G'day folks, welcome to the Art of Teaching podcast. Here we talk about how to become more compelling communicators in the way of Jesus. My name is John Tyson, a pastor here in New York City, and I'm joined by John Mark Comer, founder of Practicing the Way, and Jefferson Bethke, author of Take Back Your Family and To Hell with the Hustle. Welcome to Season 1.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Art of Teaching podcast. We want to talk today with you about developing your voice. If you know where we left off, last time we were in this room, we were talking about how we got to the call to preach, teaching, speaking, all of the above. And so now that we are past that, have shared that story, I want to talk about those first kind of 5 clunky years of like, what did it, do you remember those, okay, I'm starting to lean into a place of doing it in a repetitious way. I'm starting to do it over and over again. Do you remember those first couple years? And like, just what did those feel like? And do you remember how you preached like? Like, were you a yeller, a screamer? Did you try to go professorial? Did you try to what were you referencing? Just give me those early years. Once you're really in it.
I was really conflicted. I was a Pentecostal screamer in the early days. I mean, like combination of like screaming life coach prophet. That was the only model I had, which was basically what I would call like a rallying youth revivalist. And, the key phrase, like, I want to tell you right now. That was it. I want to tell you right, friend, I want to tell you right now. And I love
By the way, all of that is still in you.
I was just going to say that.
I was just going to say that.
I'm still going.
I was going to say,
that guy just somehow ended up with elites in New York. But all of that is in you. That's like the true you.
Yeah. There's a big part of me that was that. The second part, I left that Assemblies of God church and went to a cessationist John MacArthur Bible church.
Wow.
So I remember very, very clearly hearing people share God's word, like verse by verse, Greek, Hebrew insights. And I remember weeping the first time I went there, feeling fed in such a disorienting way. And then when I moved to, so that was both of that was in Australia. And then I moved to the US. I was in Bible college, and it was basically a combo of Willow Creek, Saddleback, heyday. And so it was all life application. And so I honestly was like really clunky. Yeah. I would like pick a passage, try and exegete it while I'd scream at you and make really good like practical application. And in some sense, I still do that today. So yes, the only, hopefully a more refined version, but it was not integrated at all. And I was very, very aware of those conflicts. When I got a preaching coach, this is just a couple of years ago, he said to me, there is a Pentecostal revivalist at war with an anointed professor in you, and you have to figure out how to integrate those. So that has been a big journey, integrating those early formative sources for me.
One more step on that. How have you started to integrate those? What does that look like?
Well, I realized that they're basically sovereign themes of God's call on my life, and they're not at war with one another. They're actually complementary. I mean, if you hear most good expositors, what you long that they would do is rally you with the truth they've just explained to you, appeal to your heart. And then if you hear someone who's like a strong exhorter, often what you wish is they'd gone a little deeper into the text and given you something beyond emotion or encouragement to actually fuel your faith with. So I'm trying to put those things together still to this day.
So will you consciously now, while you're preparing and stuff like that, kind of look for a blend of both of those? Say, hey, this whole talk is too much, Professor.
I mean, if you've taken the Art of Teaching course or you've come to our events, one of the things I do is there's a session called Finding Your Voice. Yeah. And so it's a combination of what are God's sovereign themes on your life. You need to mind those and be aware of those. They're not accidents, they're to be stewarded. Then your influences and themes, and then ultimately coming up with I don't want to call it a checklist, I would call it a reference point for every talk. So in every talk, I try and take the 6 things that I feel like I'm supposed to be stewarding and make sure that I'm putting those touches, those notes into the talk that I'm giving. So I think I've intentionally tried to integrate those, and I have a process for making sure they show up.
John Mark, what would you say to that? Those early years, what was that? What were you trying to be? What was those kind of combos?
Oh man, I've not thought about that for a long time, and I'm sitting here kind of smiling to myself at nothing like my preaching now. I mean, my preaching has changed a lot over the years. The last 5 years, my preaching have been, or maybe even 6 or 7 years, has been very different than the previous 15 years of preaching.
Oh, really?
That's a long conversation.
I'm going to follow up with that after
like
this.
a whole
I'm going to keep going
episode
though.
on
No, I want to follow up with that after
my
this
evolving
transition.
thoughts on exegetical Bible teaching versus apostolic.
we should get-
No,
we
we're
should
going to
into
jump
that.
right into
Yes.
that after you answer this question.
Yeah, that's a whole episode, but or whatever. But early on, I basically was just a carbon copy of my pastor. So again, I did not grow up in. Actually, when I was a little kid, we were in a church that apparently had good preaching, but I have no memory of that.
Yeah.
And so the church we were at in my formative kind of high school years, where I had that encounter with the Spirit of God and felt a sense of call to just pastoral ministry in a very broad kind of sense, was a very weak sauce. Like I remember as a 16-year-old just thinking this sermon is weak sauce.
If you're 16, you know that, yeah.
And so I had this amazing experience where my dad, who was the worship pastor there, was not loving it. Very long story. Ended up leaving pastoral ministry for about 5 years and going to work for a Christian nonprofit as a worship leader. Worked with Luis Palau, traveled over the world. It's an amazing experience.
Really? I didn't know that.
Itinerant,
And
travel.
it's really cool.
Yeah,
like I'm now living that with my son, where I've just I was the same age that my oldest son was, and it's actually pretty cool because those are key years for the development of an adolescent. All three of my kids are teenagers right now, and I don't know how long I'll not be leading a church, but it's really a gift to like have a little bit of space to focus more on my family in this season. Anyway, so my dad went to work for this nonprofit, and so for the first time ever in my life, I'm 17 years old, I could go to church somewhere differently than my parents. Because for all the reasons you would imagine, like there was a family expectation that I would go to church with my parents. My dad was a pastor there. First time ever, like I have a choice. And at the same time, there was this little church plant starting, kind of down the road from my house. My mom's best friend, her husband, wanted to go down and visit. It was this cool guy. And so he said, hey, why don't you come with me? So I remember we got in his little Honda Accord and we drove down the road and we went, and I'd only been in large evangelical mega churches. That's my whole life. And we went into this little church. It was in a senior center. There's maybe 70, 80 people in the room. They'd been going for about 2 months. And again, I came from a more conservative, like, you know, the pastor would preach in a suit and tie. And I'm dating myself here. This would have been 1997.
Ooh, I was 8 years old.
And I'm walking in. Oh, now I'm really dating myself.
I moved to America in 97.
Tyson was 33 years old.
Yeah,
at the
37.
time, you know? So I walk in, and there's 70, 80 people in the room, and there's a guy, and this is going to sound silly now, but for me, this was a revelatory moment. There was a guy wearing a T-shirt, cargo shorts, of course, because it's the late 90s, and Birkenstocks.
Ooh.
That's
those will come back.
Sitting on a stool with a Bible open, just walking through the text line upon line. It was it was a Calvary Chapel church plant, you know, back in the glory days of the late 90s. And my world was rocked. And it was in that I came alive. I had just bought this Volkswagen bus. I bought it from the pastor. He'd carry the whole sound system, all the setup and teardown could fit in his 1977 Volkswagen bus. I bought it from him that summer. I was there every time the doors were open. I would go to men's Bible study at 6 a.m. It was a 30-minute drive to this place. I would go to this youth group that was me and like 2 other people in the living room. I would go to their midweek Bible study. I would go to Sunday. I would do setup, teardown, work with kids, volunteer for everything. I was there every time there was anything. I was there, and
he was always teaching.
Formative experience. No, it wasn't always him, but it was a lot of him. But just the experience,
That's what I mean.
and that's where I got a vision for church planting, which was not even on my radar. Again, I did not come from that world, and that's where I got a vision for teaching. It was the first time I ever saw somebody just teaching the Bible, and I didn't have a sense that I would be good at it, but that's where I got a vision for it. So, long story short, then I ended up on staff at a Calvary Chapel mega church. And all sorts of thoughts about that, and I won't moralize them right here. But there was a high value for teaching and a low bar of entry for ministry. So there I was, 19 years old, on staff at this church. And the incredible thing
19.
was,
That's crazy.
they called me a pastor at 19 years old. I'd been through a 1-year-long pastoral training school.
Wow.
That's it. Not a bachelor's degree, nothing. And I mean, it's a very anti-intellectual movement, so I have all sorts of thoughts about that. But one thing they did really well was they would take risks on young leaders.
Wow.
And so and it was an attractional model of church. So there was church basically 6 nights a week in various things. And for several years of my life, I would teach 2 or 3 times a day, 6 days a week.
Wow.
Now, this isn't like sermons to large groups of people.
6 days a week?
Most of this was like
you get your
19 high
10,000
school
hours in?
kids at like a pizza, high school Bible
That's
study.
accelerating, yeah.
Yeah, because I was one of like 6 youth pastors or whatever. But I had every single day. My days were basically, I get up in the morning. We had like a morning hour-long worship and prayer kind of thing at the church. Then I would spend a couple hours writing a teaching and I'd go do it. Then I spend another couple hours writing a teaching and go do it at night. So basically every single day, and sometimes 3 times because there was a morning Bible study too, I would teach 2 or 3 times a day. Now, it was horrific teaching, but it was an extraordinary gift. I did the math when I first read Outliers.
End times charts? Was it Calvary end times charts?
Full on. And there was New Year's Eve every year was a prophecy update where we would talk about what European Union leader was possibly the
horns,
Antichrist.
the little horns.
And it was the whole thing, and the locusts are Apache helicopters, and China's going to have an army coming down this river valley.
I mean, and
it was not I can laugh about it now, but this was like, it was a form of like spiritual trauma for me for many, many years. That took me many years to not have my ministry be a reaction against that. And for many people listening, it may not be funny anymore. Still, I'm so sorry. But it was an incredible experience. The moral of that story is, it's not a moral, but it was an incredible chance. Like when I first read Outliers and the 10,000, hour rule, I like did the napkin math, and I estimated when did I get to 10,000 hours? And 2 things. One that was uncanny. It was the month that I came up with. I went back and looked at our preaching calendar. Was the month that we started this series in 1 Corinthians, and it was the first series where I ever felt like I had my own voice and I was good at what I did. First, literally to the month.
Wow.
And the nice thing was that would have been, I think I was, this is gonna sound horrible and mean to people listening. I think I was 28 years old.
Wow.
And it's because I got my 10,000 hours in by 28.
Yeah.
Because I'm literally, all I did was preach. And then once we planted, I would preach 2 sermons a week.
No undergraduate for you?
I eventually went on and did an undergraduate. Sadly, I went to the local, I'm so poorly educated early on. I went to a community college against their will. They were mad at me that I was trying to go to college while I was working at the church.
Wow.
And they would regularly tell me I'm not trusting God.
Wow.
And the disciples never went to college. It was a very anti-intellectual movement. That actually this church ended up completely imploding and due to bad theology. I mean, all sorts of things.
But you got your 10,000
But
hours.
I was there at a moment where it was a genuine move of God, and I got my 10,000 hours in.
Okay, no, I do have a question on that though. Let's talk about that maybe for the second half. We got 8-9 minutes. The 10,000 hours, again, you, like we've said, there's research there that flexes a little bit, but it's true. The core's true. It's absolutely true that you have to
The research is verified, but it's 10,000 hours of dedicated practice.
Exactly.
So that's where Malcolm Gladwell, some people have pushed back.
Yes.
They're saying it's not just like random, it's dedicated, deliberate practice.
So let's talk about that for a second, because I think this is key.
Hey everybody, John Mark Comer here from The Art of Teaching. I just want to take a moment and invite you to our annual conference. Every year we gather with preachers and teachers from all over the country and all over the world to dedicate ourselves more deeply to our craft and our call before God. This coming year is a new venue for us in a new city. We're going to Nashville, which is one of my favorite cities in the country. We're bringing in some phenomenal guests to partner with us, myself and Tyson and others, to teach this stuff, and we would love to have you there. For more information, go to theartofteaching.co.
I don't know if you guys have felt this. I mean, I'm younger than you guys by a decade, but I think we all actually have very similar stories where we would probably say we got in earlier than we expected or thought. I'm doing consistent communication.
Which is not necessarily good, by the way.
I agree.
There are parts of it I really wish had not happened.
I agree.
I did everything about a decade early.
Yes.
And
it has its own complications and implications.
Its own set of issues.
I'm making videos, doing podcasts, and preaching at other people's churches pretty consistently by 22, and that has its own complications and things I don't like about it as well. But same thing. We got there of that comfortable in your skin, comfortable in your voice. My question is,
it took me a long time to get to that.
I agree, but my question is, here was my pattern with that last decade, is what I'm trying to say. My pattern was, and I want to talk about this for the last little bit. The first 4 years of that, of okay, I'm doing this consistently and I'm going to be doing it consistently, was me basically just copying my favorite people.
Yes.
Okay. Then after that, it maybe is honed in to only copying a few people that I feel like are really who I want to be like. Then that third season is kind of the like, okay, I actually now don't want to listen to anyone because I actually feel like
at some point they're not helpful.
I felt a tipping point where it wasn't helpful, and actually if I go into a vacuum, it'll actually really push me over the edge.
No, I'm the same way.
My voice, my
I
space.
love Tyson's preaching, and I had to discipline myself to stop listening to his podcast.
Yeah.
Because he's so good.
Yes.
And I find myself all of a sudden not sounding like me, but like a bad version of him without a cool accent.
So let's talk about that, because the axiom I would say out of that I would encourage people with, unless you guys agree or disagree, is I think it's okay, listen to everyone, copy everyone for a stint.
No,
and there becomes a stint where it's not helpful.
I think it's inevitable. So a key book for me, which is not a book on preaching, it's on writing, is on this book on writing well by William Zinsser, who was a Yale professor, had this creative writing class. He wrote one of the best books on writing I've ever read. And he has a whole chapter on finding your voice. And he basically, and he's much smarter than I am, does the science on how the human brain is wired to learn. And we learn through mirror neurons, through imitation. Like we learn through imitation, hence the Jesus come and follow me, hence the Paul imitate me as I imitate Christ, you know? And so if you think about little children, how does a child learn to talk? Say mom, me, say daddy, no daddy, no daddy. Like that's how we learn. And in a much more sophisticated way, I actually think that's how we learn to preach as well.
Yes.
So my early years of preaching, I just sounded like my pastor. This was, I'm again dating myself like nobody's business. This is, I think, either pre-podcasts or they were out there, but I didn't have an iPod. It was your only.
Not an iPhone,
isn't that where podcasting comes from? Like,
it was early. People don't realize it's
iPod and broadcasting. It was an attempt to bring like radio.
And it's gone through generations.
To
it was
iPods.
huge when they first did the iPod. Then it dipped for like 5 years, and now we're back in podcast generation.
So maybe it was there, but I remember like my pastor had a tape ministry and a radio ministry. He was a well-known pastor or whatever, and you would
I don't know
like
what tape
buy the
ministry
tape
is, but I'm
cassette
tracking.
like in plastic container thing. Like this is so embarrassing. I am dating myself. But a profound shift happened for me when podcasts became available. And I just remember listening, there were 3 teachers that I would listen to, or preachers. I remember listening to Rob Bell. This was the early days. He was an Orthodox Christian. He was exegeting Leviticus.
Creative ability.
And I've never heard anything like that in my life. The ability to bring the Bible alive, the Old Testament alive.
All those Ray Vander Laan insights.
Yeah, all the Ray Vander Laan.
Just copied.
Full on ripped. Like the rabbis
But he presented better. But he presented.
When I found those videos, I was like, that's where it came from. That's not to disparage him. It gave me a hope. Like you just got to find the sources. What he was doing was unbelievable. Erwin McManus in LA, remember listening. I'm like, whatever that is nothing like preaching in my context or church. It was creative. They didn't sound like, I grew up in a very churchy culture. It was all this like Christianese and sloppy theology and all this, and quivery like preacher voice. They were like cool, and they talked like ordinary people, and they had stories from culture. And this would have been early Matt Chandler, and he was more exegetical, and he was fiery and angry, but man, that dude could exegete the text. And so then I went through about 5 years where I just sounded like
Erwin, Matt
a
Chandler.
really bad version of Rob Bell and Erwin McManus with occasional angry moments exegeting like Chandler.
I was that same Venn diagram, except I had Keller in there instead of Chandler.
Ooh, see, I didn't come to Keller till way later.
Yeah, I was Keller.
The professor.
Yeah, I was Keller, Bell, and McManus, and I literally Venn diagrammed them in a finding my voice exercise when I was probably 28, and that's you said something interesting. I didn't start preaching weekly until I was 28.
Yeah. Wow, and he was reaching 10,000
hours.
Yeah,
you're at 10,000 hours, and I'm like, okay, folks, how do we do this on the regular?
Yeah.
That was the first time I really started doing sermon series, being in charge of the pulpit diet of a congregation. That's when I planted a church in New York City. So that's really interesting.
I might have been more like 30. I'd have to go back and look at a calendar. It was somewhere in there, late 20s, 30 that I hit.
Yeah, I was basically doing youth talks back then. One youth talk a week, the occasional weekend, July 4th or January the 1st. I was the guy they'd put up then. But then once I got into it, I was like, okay, man, I felt like I had a natural ability and a gifting, but I started chasing it down, and then I would take any teaching opportunity I could get.
Absolutely.
Campus ministry, 4 nights a week. I just would I got to get better at this quick.
But I think, for young teachers, one of the most important things you can do is curate your inputs.
Yes.
Like curate the voices that you listen to, because you will end up sounding like them. And I actually don't think that's all bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like I still think about my preaching now, which has evolved much more. It's become more true to who I am. I feel like it's not like super unique, but it's more like, all right, I feel like I am what I am. But still, from Bell, I got bringing the Bible alive in historical context with creativity. From McManus, talking in a non-preacher, non-churchy voice, using cultural analysis. And from Chandler, just exegeting the text with passion for holiness,
Yeah.
And I still think all of that is in me at some level, though I don't think I sound like that anymore, or I don't listen to that anymore. I haven't listened in many, many, many years. And then I do remember reaching a point where I had to stop. I used to just was a fiendish podcaster. Every single run, I would listen to all of those guys' sermons every single week. And now I can't remember the last time. Charlie Dates was the last time I listened to a sermon. And it's different enough that it can feed my soul without me feeling like I'm going to steal that or rip that or whatever. You know?
So that's interesting. I had to stop listening to Keller, man. I was like, this guy's too good. And it was making me lazy, because his outlines were so simple, which is like point 1, point 2, Jesus is the true and better. And every time he did it was the best thing you've ever heard. And I remember just I sort of reached a point where I'm smart enough where I can change the outline where it's personalized, you can't recognize the source. But I realized all I'm doing is getting good at imitation. I'm not getting to the point where I'm figuring out who I am. And
it was kind of a sad moment for me, because preaching had played such a key role in my spiritual formation. So I stopped listening to sermons, not for formation reasons, but for craft of preaching reasons. The problem wasn't that the sermons were still feeding my soul.
Yes.
And it was almost like a sad moment. Like I miss having that nourishment in my inner spiritual life. But I felt like I had to stop, because there was an impetus now on me to set down all the people that I've been learning from and to begin to find my voice.
One thing I think is so important, you can tell, you go to a church website, and you can see by their phrases who's using which pieces of what. It's really, really fascinating. A church's mission statement, or you look at their vision or their sermon series, or
the length of their T-shirt, or whether or not they use a handheld mic or a side mic. You can tell a lot just by that.
The emphasis that people have, I think it's really interesting. And again, if I had any wish for the folks that were listening to this podcast, it would be immediately 25% less input from anybody and 25% more wrestling with God to find your own voice.
Yeah.
Because you get, there's some folks that are just like, I see folks say, I see that sermon series I did in that sermon series you're doing.
Yeah.
I see John Mark's stuff all over this. I see Rich Philotis in there. I see you can basically see where. And again, I always feel like honored that I'm doing something that's helpful. You're obviously such an inspiration to so many people, but I do think, man, I just wish that they would wrestle a little more themselves.
Yeah,
a little more themselves.
And on the flip side, I'd say if you're really early, also take a deep breath and give yourself permission. Like one of the things that Zinzer would do in his writing class is he would have them read an excellent chapter or essay or piece of journalism. He'd have them read through it, put it down, and then rewrite it in their own words.
Yeah.
And I actually think there's something to that to preaching, like early. That's actually a great way to learn, but I agree. But cut back sooner than you think. Who was the church father? Was it Gregory of Nyssa who had the channels versus reservoirs? Have you guys read that? Was it John Chrysostom? Golden tongue. He was such a good preacher. I've been reading his sermons lately, that they called him golden mouthed, is what that means.
That's a good
nickname.
Said, golden tongue. I want that nickname.
Most preachers are channels. What they need to be is reservoirs.
Don't just
Meaning
let it go
most
through
of us, they get all this information in their brain, and then it flows through them out to other people in a sermon. But what you need to do is become a reservoir.
It
create
percolates.
this deep well, this deep like cavern of learning and insight and life experience and confession of sin and wrestling with God, and let it just spill out. Let people draw from it in time. But that's the work of a lifetime.
I love that. I love that.
So one last thing, sorry, because I see that you're trying to shut this thing down. One thing I think is the only preaching I'm really watching these days is I'm asking, how did they do that?
Yes.
So
you're looking for
that's exactly. I'm
the
looking
thing
for
behind
the craft.
You're 100% looking at the craft.
The amount
100%
of
looking at the
people,
craft.
the kinds of folks that I pay attention to these days are definitely outside my tradition. Sometimes even my theological bandwidth, but I'm looking at phenomenal communicators to say, how do I get better?
Yep.
How do I improve? And I think there's definitely a difference. There's I'm trying to learn how to do it, so I'm graciously imitating. There's I'm trying to figure out the craft of what they did so that I can get better myself, not learn, but improve. And then you've got that sloppy spot in the middle, which I think sometimes that's what I'm warning against, which is I'm kind of lazy, so let me just regurgitate someone else's stuff. So I'll just listen to them and then do a poor version of it. I don't think that stuff is that helpful.
And I think we're too slow to trust like what the Spirit of Jesus is giving us in our hearts.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I still struggle with that. I feel like, man, before I've been teaching for a while now. On a lot of different topics, I could sit down with a blank. This is the first time in my life. I could sit down with a blank Word doc and my Bible next to me, and I could have something to say.
Yeah.
But I still feel like, okay, before I teach on whatever, I need to go read 4 or 5 books and put all the notes in and get all the quotes. And that's not all bad, but I do wonder if actually I'm not trusting what the Spirit of Jesus has deposited into my heart.
Yeah.
Our goal with the art of teaching is to help people get better at the process and craft
Not just
themselves.
Yes.
Find their
voice.
Understand God's word. We'll give you our best stuff on how we've learned to do it, but it's so that you can go do that yourself in the context God has called you to do.
And I think, too, I to what you just said, John Mark, I think it's almost like a self-awareness of the anxiousness in your spirit about that. I think if there's that anxiety of I need to go get us, like read all the sources or read all the things rather than, okay, I have that rhema like you've talked about, those coals you've talked about, and then I want to go surround myself with voices in a non-anxious way. That's a different way of preparing that's not cloning, not copying. So go ahead. Yeah.
Well,
Close us out.
Well, what's interesting, you bring up a good point. The goal of teaching should not be just coming up with good stuff.
Yes.
It should be loving the people that you're communicating to. It should be listening to God on their behalf. To
loving
feed
them with truth.
Yeah, to give them the word that they need. And so my assumption is that the majority of people in my church today listen to multiple other pastors and sources of content. So I'm not trying to be the best preacher. I'm trying to be a person who can help them. Hey, you're a part of my community. I'm trying to love you and serve you. I'm trying to discern forces that could sabotage your spiritual development, your walk with Jesus. And so I'm crafting my stuff in a way that I think is very different than the general voices they're listening to, which is for them out of love in our context. And if you put your emphasis on that, a lot of that anxiety melts off. I'm not trying to preach in such a way to be as good as the other people that they're listening to. I'm trying to preach in such a way that I'm serving them through a discernment of the Spirit, life together, and bringing God's word to feed them there. So I think that's the biggest way one of the ways that relieves a lot of the pressure I feel is serving the people that are given to me.
That's a salient, perfect point to end on, because I think you just flipped on its head what I think sometimes is a lot of pastors and preachers' anxiety, which is my people are listening to a lot of other world-class people. Man, I can't do that. But what you're almost saying is assume they are, you just need to, but those people can't serve your people.
Yes.
So serve your people with the teaching you have in that room, for that context, for that locality, for that church.
One of John and I's highest values is contextualization.
Yep.
It's one of the things that I think
only
people
you can do
appreciate
that.
about our preaching, and we can't do that for other people.